What's up, everyone? Today we're reacting to what happens when you're banned from your own country. And I'm going to be checking it out because I wanted to know what would happen. You know? Okay, grab your drinks. I got my 2-liter Coca-Cola with me. I'm just joking. But yeah, we will be drinking that and watching this and reacting to it. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's get into the video.
No place like home, but what happens when your home doesn't want you anymore? This is what happens when you're banned from your own country. Formerly known as exile, it's a punishment that has been discarded by the modern world in favor of more traditional punishments, such as either the death penalty or imprisonment, per the Universal Declaration on Human Rights.
So they would rather you die instead of just being exiled, you know? Interesting. That's equivalent to being exiled.
The punishment of exile is technically illegal, not to mention largely impractical.
But killing someone is not illegal.
Threat to the current government. Modern mass media gives these individuals a platform no matter the country of origin. So authoritarian countries such as China and Iran simply imprison or murder political dissidents.
Yeah,
however,
easier,
Georgia,
you know?
Who likes to occasionally pretend it's still 1820, actually has a law in the books where criminals face the punishment of banishment. The Georgia state Constitution forbids banishment outside of the state, though, and thus criminals are instead banished from all but one of the state's 158 counties, with Eccles County being the only county criminals charged with various crimes such as drug possession or sale, burglary, stalking, assault or battery, prostitution, or making terror threats to a judge can live. Instead,
these animations, man.
To leave the state altogether. But that's not the only U.S. state to practice banishment. 16 states have constitutional provisions against banishment, and in states without these provisions, appeals courts have generally shot down the sentence. Tennessee, which rarely realizes it's not 1820, still allows permanent exile from the state, and Maryland's constitution prescribes it for the crime of corruption, the thinking being that a corrupt public official has no business remaining in the state and within the systems they used for their advantage. But while
rather than just being in jail,
illegal, the nuances of banishment see it used as a punishment in specific situations. Exiling an American citizen from their own country is unconstitutional, but the United States regularly deports non-nationals and forbids them from re-entry. Should these individuals re-enter, they are either immediately deported again or sometimes imprisoned. An individual may be banished from areas around schools or daycare crime, though, and this is an increasingly popular punishment in the U.S. Gang members are also sometimes banished from their hometowns in an effort to try and disconnect them from the very influences that turn them the way they are. Given a lot of gangs' national reach, though, this is likely rather limited in effectiveness and is probably counterintuitive to rehabilitation. Banishment can often cut someone off from their support networks in the form of family and friends, and has proven repeatedly without these support networks, the odds of reformation plummet dramatically. Banishment or exile, however, has a long history that stretches.
So it doesn't work. That's what we're getting from this. It does not work.
Western penal codes can be traced back to the ancient Greeks and Romans.
Of course, literally everything that's like democratic is basically Rome or Greece has come. Yeah.
Very likely still be a death sentence, with communities so far
nothing's original.
Towns or villages largely xenophobic towards strangers. Banishment would force someone to wander the wilderness and attempt to live on their own. Survival is pretty tough stuff, and even tougher when you're alone. Cut off from a community's support, starvation, injury, or illness would quickly claim banished individuals. Banishment was a very effective measure for a long time. The punishment was as dreaded as a death sentence, and having a family member or close friend who is exiled would be a humiliating affair. In the necessary tight-knit communities of the past, this would severely erode one's social standing, which could affect everything from regular business affairs to marriage propositions. An entire family could be condemned by the shame of exile, as others ostracized the remaining family members, and marriage proposals were declined. In the case that the exiled individual was the head of the household, though, the condemnation of the family could be quite literal. Without a breadwinner, a family would quickly fall to poverty, and with no community support, might well face death from starvation. Thus, sometimes entire families would follow the individual into exile. Better to work together at survival in the wild than to slowly starve to death and die off.
I feel like that you shouldn't, you know, follow him because, you know, ended up dying is most likely like the cause of what happens when you banished. You know, that's what they're saying. feel like that's not a good idea to follow him or follow her, the person.
Their way to another community, ideally a larger one where they would become lost in the crowd. Smaller communities might still
like illegal immigrants.
Thus, word would spread from one to another, making an exiled individual
Just
unwelcome.
joking.
As villages grew into cities, though, the large metropolitan spaces gave plenty of room for one to lose themselves and their past amongst the mass of humanity. In Roman times, exile would regularly be practiced on individuals who hadn't quite deserved a death sentence, or perhaps in response to petitions for leniency by influential individuals. Given the bloodthirsty nature of Roman culture, though, exile was actually implemented to help curb the amount of capital punishment.
See, now it's Rome.
Exile also allowed a degree of flexibility as opposed to death, which was rather final. Thus, an individual could be exiled from cities, regions, or even the empire.
At least I'm not dead.
Punishment more fairly matching the crime. Sometimes these punishments were
This guy
temporary,
talks
other times
way
they were
too
permanent,
fast.
and
Like,
individuals
are you like
avoid a worse
fully
punishment. The
focused to
vilest
it?
form of banishment
That's
in
what you
Roman
gotta
culture
ask.
was relegation and was widely used on undesirable foreigners. The decree would simply demand that an individual or group leave Rome altogether, or a specific
So
province
banishment,
for
just
a certain
bad.
length of time. Sometimes this could be for life, but unlike other forms of banishment, relegation still allowed Roman citizens to retain their civil rights. The more severe form of
Okay.
banishment was aquae et ignis interdicto, which meant debarred from fire and water. This form of banishment could also be for a specific length of time or for life, but the condemned suffered a further penalty. They lost all rights as a Roman citizen for the duration. This included property, which would often be confiscated by the state. Even if one was not exiled from the entirety of Rome, living within the empire without the protection of Roman civil rights was a rather perilous affair. Deportation was the most severe form of banishment, and in this case the individual was immediately arrested and forced into exile out of the empire. Often this meant the individual was sent to live on a remote Mediterranean island, where it was reasonably certain they would never be able to return from. Should the exiled somehow find their way off the island, though, re-entering Rome would often lead straight to capital punishment. Exile quickly grew in popularity in Rome and became the default punishment for anyone seen as threatening the established way of Roman life and public morality. To that end, Jews, philosophers preaching non-state-sponsored ideologies, magicians, dancers, actors,
All
poets,
got
and
banished.
astrologers would commonly face exile, with most of the victims being men. Most of these exiles, though, didn't face deportatio or even aquae et ignis interdicto, as
Okay.
they were allowed to retain their property, but rather they were simply told to stay a certain distance outside of a specific city, province, or the empire itself. As they were allowed to retain their property, those banished could sell their property off to fund their journey and start a new life. Fast forward to the Age of Sail, though, and several countries saw exile or transportation as an extremely effective way of expanding their global power. During the Age of Sail, European powers began setting up colonies all over the world, most notably in the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia.
How do we go from Rome to this? My mind is just going. Don't even.
Live somewhere relatively uncivilized. Fewer yet were willing to actually stay there long term. Soon, European courts came up with an elegant solution: simply send people against their will. European penal code during this time was absolutely.
Oh yeah, like the workers to
Well over 100 offenses
just work on the
punishable by
boats.
death. By simply changing some of these punishments from death to transportation, European powers generated a veritable army of unwilling laborers to help expand their colonial power
Like
around the
slaves.
world. In England, people were being sent to
I'm
America
being very,
since
very, no,
1754,
just,
but with the passing of the
my bad.
1717, the number of forcibly transported individuals quickly skyrocketed. Criminals were still being sent to America until the very outbreak of the War of Independence, when the Americans won their freedom with the thanks of the French. The British were faced with a serious problem: where to send thousands of unwanted criminals? The answer presented itself shortly after the discovery of
Oh yeah, Australia was like a
11 ships
a
left for
prison.
Portsmouth with 736 convicts on board. 40 of them died during the incredible 8-month journey to the land down under. That hardly stopped British courts from ordering many more people to their Australian colonies.
I'm not gonna say what I'm
The population of
thinking.
Convicts versus actual settlers was exponentially larger, something that made regular settlers rather uncomfortable. Most of these convicts, though, were eligible to return to England after a set amount of time, typically 7 to 14 years. But this came with a huge catch. While forced to work in penal colonies building basic infrastructure for nascent colonies, prisoners earned no money. Thus, when their sentence was up, they faced a rather difficult task of paying for a ticket back home. Some were lucky to have family that could secure them a voyage back home, but most simply opted just to stay and build a new life in Australia. This was not an accident, but had always been carefully considered by British courts, who knew growing, thriving colonies in most far-flung parts of the world would be incredibly difficult. But
Oh,
most
meanness,
weren't
sir.
as bad as one might assume. Most of these facing banishment were accused of theft, and this punishment was doled out regularly for even the most petty of larcenies. Children were frequently charged with theft theft for simply stealing an apple and could very realistically
sent to Australia as a child, you know?
or individuals seen as troublemakers in the eyes of the
No,
law.
how would they even survive?
Women, though, making things rather grim for any men forced to remain behind after their sentence. Once in Australia, convicts
I feel bad for the woman, you know, everyone, every criminal just going insane.
Were usually assigned to a free settler in the same way that Southern Americans used slaves, though British convicts in exile did have certain rights that, in theory, at least protected them. In practice, these rights were largely ignored by their settler overseers, and local authorities were not very often concerned with the welfare of convicts. Sometimes, though, settlers would face punishment for the abuse of convicts, but the sheer distance between the colonies and England meant the enforcement of civil rights for convicts was rather lax. Punishments could run from increased sentences to whippings or beatings. Those who were viewed as particularly troublesome would be sentenced to work in even more remote settlements as part of a chain gang. However, this life was not bad for some of the convicts, as many a free settler treated their convicts much like hired hands rather than slaves. This could make a long sentence much more endurable.
Sure, that's what they wrote in the books, like, you know, we were really nice to them when in reality, probably weren't.
Reduced sentences for good behavior, earning their freedom
Just
after
shouting.
3 years. However, this did not include a ticket home, and thus most convicts were simply forced to stay. If you're an Australian citizen today, odds are good you descended from one of these prisoners. Banishment and exile have largely fallen out of favor.
Is that why?
Exiles today are voluntary. The Dalai Lama, for example, is a voluntary exile from his home of Tibet, having fled after the Chinese government invaded and forced
in
him to
India.
leave the
He's
country.
in India.
He's a figure of Tibetan freedom, though. Had he remained behind, it almost is certain that he would have been imprisoned for life or simply killed. As has happened with many other religious figures the Chinese government viewed as troublesome. Napoleon Bonaparte, though, might be the most famous exile in history, having been exiled twice.
Poisoned by copper.
Stopped trying to
I know.
take over the world. After
Mercury
being
or
defeated
something.
the first time, he was sent to exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba in 1813, but with the help of supporters managed to return to France to wage a new war. After his second defeat, he was once more exiled.
He should have just learned from his first mistake, you know, never to do it again, you know?
What actually happened to prisoners sent to Australia? Or click this other video instead.
Or subscribe to this channel and click the another video that's gonna be popping up on the screen, you know? If you like this, hit like, subscribe, share, and this is fun. I mean, I guess, you know, we'll definitely be having more videos kind of like this, more interesting, more informational videos, and yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Let's go.